So we are all waiting, holding our breath for the budget, and we know more tax increases are coming, and we are all, I assume, incredibly frustrated at the constant pressure on our wallets from the government. But why do they keep having to take our money? In today's video, I wanted to cover a few of the reasons that we as a country are in the situation that we're in. So let's start with a quick look at public finances over time. The blue line on this chart shows the receipts that the government brings in, mostly through taxes, and the red line shows the government spending on things like public services, welfare, pensions, and debt interest. Now, these are both presented in terms of a percentage of GDP, i.e. the UK's national income. That's the combined income of everyone in the country, not the government income. The government's income is essentially the blue line. That's the share of national income that the government takes in tax. Currently, in 2025, the government takes in about 39% of national income in tax. And government spending accounts for about 44% of national income, or GDP. So think about it. If government receipts are 39% of GDP, and it is spending 44% of GDP, the government is running a deficit of about 5%. Now, this is not unusual. Whenever the red line is above the blue line, we are running a deficit. So only very briefly between 1999 and 2001 were we in a surplus. So the government was spending less than its receipts. Now, since the turn of the millennium, government receipts were mostly between 35 and 37% of GDP. Now, since COVID, it has risen to 39%. So overall, we are taxed more than we used to be. Now, government spending itself has fluctuated a lot more than receipts. It was falling in the 1990s, then rising in the 2000s, then it massively spiked up at the time of the financial crisis because we had to bail out the banks. Then we had austerity, which everyone loved. And you can see from 2011 to 2020, spending as a share of GDP fell to where it had been before the financial crisis. But COVID made it spike again due to furlough, and now we're about back to where we were in 2013. But pretty much every year since 2002, we've been running a deficit. So that means that every year consistently, the government has been spending more than the receipts that it brings in. So we've been steadily piling on to the national debt. Now let's have a look at the debt to GDP ratio. So here we move from the deficit, which is, like we said, the difference between what the government brings in and what the government spends in any single year, to the debt, which is what the government owes overall. Scary numbers. So these are the public sector net financial liabilities, i.e. our national debt, again as a percentage of GDP. Now, we present it like this so you can compare our national debt to our national income. So, for example, say you owe 300k in mortgage debt, but your salary is 60k. That means your debts are 500% of your income. So this is how we are thinking about national debt. Now, before the financial crisis, our national debt was below 35% of national income, GDP. After the financial crisis, as our sort of year-on-year deficits were running high, the debt actually jumped to over 70% of GDP. Now, it did start to come down for a bit, but then, once again, COVID messed everything up. And now it is sitting at over 80% of GDP. So let's quickly look at what that means, because you might be wondering, okay, but who pays this and who do they pay? The answer to who pays it is us, taxpayers. And unfortunately, every pound that is spent on national debt is a pound that is not spent on public services. And who do we pay? Holders of UK government bonds. Now, pension funds hold a lot of bonds. So if you save into a pension, it's quite likely that some of this debt is funneling its way to you into your pension pot. Government bonds, as you probably know, are a pretty safe investment, and they have a predictable return. So they are generally quite valuable to investors, especially for investors who maybe don't have 40 years to ride out the highs and lows of the stock market. So government debt actually provides a useful source of stability in the financial system. Another way that public sector debt is useful is it allows us to sort of spread the cost of public sector investment over future generations. We are still benefiting today from things that were built decades ago, roads, railways, canals, telecom lines, etc. If those investments were all paid for upfront by the people that were around at the time, they would have been getting a pretty bad deal. They would have had to pay huge amounts upfront for things that were going to go mostly to future generations. So paying for long-term public investments through government borrowing is a way of spreading the cost more fairly through generations. So overall, government debt is not necessarily a bad thing. You need to remember that, as long as it's sustainable and it doesn't get out of control. So pretty much just like any other debt. So what does sustainable debt actually mean? Well, you don't want the interest on the debt to keep growing and draining away the resources that could be spent on public services. Remember what we said, that every pound spent on debt is a pound we can't invest in public services. Now, a good measure of sustainability when it comes to debt is that it shouldn't be growing as a percentage of GDP. Ideally, you want it to be falling, especially from the really high levels that we're at now of over 80% of GDP. Now, we pay interest on the overall stock of debt, so the higher it is, the more you pay. A bit like when you still owe a lot of capital on your mortgage. If you've ever looked at the beginning of your mortgage, the majority of what you pay is interest, and you're not really paying down the capital a lot. So to get this down, there are three things that matter. The first is GDP growth. How fast our national income is growing. Now, if our economy is growing at a fast rate, we're all getting richer, great, and naturally tax receipts grow with that, because the more money you make, the more you're going to pay in tax, right? And that ends up with the government being able to have more tax receipts without actually putting up tax rates. Now, the second thing that matters is the rate of interest on government debt. Like we said, every year you are paying interest on the whole stock of debt, and the amount you pay is going to depend on the rate of that interest. And lastly, the annual budget. Is it in deficit or is it in surplus? If you're running a surplus or even a small deficit and your GDP growth is high, your debt will fall as a percentage of GDP. But if you're running a bigger deficit, then your debt will rise. So let's look at those three things one by one. Firstly, GDP growth. This chart shows the rate at which our economy has grown year on year since 1990. The red years are recessions, so we had one in 1990 to 91, and then the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and then the big one in the COVID year, although that was really because everything was locked down and we had a big growth spike when it all reopened in 2021. Because the growth is year on year, so obviously we had a massive lockdown, then the massive reopening, right? But notice how growth generally used to be a lot higher before the financial crisis. We would quite often grow at 3, 4%, sometimes even 5% per year. Now, after the financial crisis, we did have a few decent years in 2014 and 2017, but we are now quite often at 2% or less per year, and that's not great. So, interest rates on government bonds. The other problem we've had in the past 3 years is high interest rates on UK government debt. This chart shows the yields, i.e. the rate of interest, on 10-year government bonds. So the rate that the government pays on a 10-year loan. Now, we used to get really good rates, below 2% or sometimes even below 1%. Between 2019 and 2022, it was almost close to zero. But it spiked up again in 2022. Remember all the chaos after the Liz Truss budget when everybody's mortgage rates went up? It has stayed consistently high since and is forecast to go even higher. Now, the UK isn't alone in this situation. Other countries' governments are also paying higher interest rates on their debt. But it does create another problem for public finances because we are now paying more interest on our debt than we're used to. Now, this chart, the yellow line, shows our debt interest payments as a percentage of GDP, and you can see we're paying more than we ever did before going back all the way to the 50s. And finally, the budget deficit. Let's go back to that first chart again and talk about the third factor in debt sustainability, the budget deficit. We saw here how government spending is about 44% of GDP and is bringing in about 39% of GDP in receipts. So again, we are looking at a deficit of about 5% of GDP. Now, back in the year 2000, government spending was less than 35% of GDP. So why is it nearly 10 percentage points higher today? Well, we have an aging population. With that come bigger pension liabilities, and for a long time, we've prioritized protecting pensioners with things such as the triple lock. We saw last year how there was a big outcry when the government tried to take away the pensioners' winter fuel allowance. As a result of the aging population, there's also more strain on the NHS. On top of the fact that just by default, an aging population puts strain on the NHS, there are generally bigger spending commitments in the NHS because we have new drugs available and just bigger ability to treat people. This obviously is a vicious circle because as a result of that, people are living longer and adding to the pressure. Now, since COVID happened, we've had a generally sicker population, and there's been a big increase in people claiming long-term sick or disability benefits. Now, Rachel Reeves did try to reform this last year, but she was forced to change course after rebellions from her own MPs. And we also live in a much more uncertain world since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And with the US being under Trump, they are slightly less reliable as an ally, so we have a bit of pressure to up our defense spending. So what does Rachel Reeves actually need to do? She needs to close that massive 5% gap between government spending and government receipts, and she needs to do it quickly. As she has seen when she has proposed various measures to reduce welfare, it is not easy to reduce spending because there will be always groups of people who are affected, and therefore there will be groups of people who strongly campaign against it. This means she is likely to do a combination of some spending reductions and some tax increases. Now, one of the easiest ways to increase government receipts is by increasing one of the big three taxes: income tax, national insurance, or VAT. Now, these can raise huge sums even with a tiny increase because so many people pay them. But because the Labour Party ruled out these increases in their manifesto, Rachel Reeves has been trying to tinker with different ways of doing it. But these can hit different groups disproportionately without raising enough money. So it is looking likely, well, more and more likely, that she is going to do one of the three and break their manifesto pledge. But we already saw on that chart that taxes as a share of national income are incredibly high. So there's not much further that she can push this. So do you think she can get the spending down? It is worth noting from that chart actually that we were spending around the same percentage of GDP, so 44%, back in 2013, and then we had it below 40% between 2017 and 2020, so before COVID hit. Now, if we were back at those levels with current tax rates, we would be back on the sustainable path again. But that did require tough choices. That was an era called austerity. So if she does this again, she's not exactly going to be popular. So what are your thoughts? What do you think she should do? What are your views on the state of the economy and why we're in the position we're in? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time. Bye.